So let's look at how the wrists function biomechanically within the swing. We've dealt with shoulder coil, we've dealt with forearm rotation, and now we're talking about wrist hinge or wrist cock. So this is the movement that we think about when we say wrist cock or wrist hinge. It's that movement. And you end up with 90 degrees between your forearm and the shaft. Now, the shoulders start off with 0 and they move through 90. The forearms start off with 0 and rotate through 90. The wrists are a bit different. If the club were up my sleeve, I would be finding 90 degrees of movement. But the club gives me a certain amount of angle before I start. So if we say that's 45 degrees. So basically my wrist cock to 90. They move through 45. So that's just interesting. Just pick up on that. Shoulder coil is 90 in the backswing. Forearm rotation is 90. Wrist cock is through 45 degrees. Now lots of you will know from previous lessons I like to give you 3 for the price of 2. If we cock our wrist to 90 and turn our shoulder, we end up with the forearms for free. Let me show that from the front. There's wrist cock, there's shoulder turn. My forearm has rotated. So the reality is there's 90 wrist, 90 forearm and 90 shoulder. That is reality. But in working practice, I can give you 3 for the price of 2. If I hinge my wrists, that's 1/3 of my golf swing, and turn my shoulders, that's the 2/3, and get my forearms for free. Now, the older we get as golfers, the more cautious we become about hinging our wrists. It is counterintuitive. You think, well, Luther, if I start hinging my wrist all over the place, I'll be less accurate. The reverse is true. Wrist hinge makes you more accurate. So when a club maker gives you a driver that's 45 inches long, he's encouraging your forearms for power and your body for power. He's telling your wrist to keep quiet. However, when the club maker gives you a wedge, he's asking you to create the most wrist hinge in the least amount of time. So wristy activity is good for pitching, for bunker play, and for accuracy. Here's my familiar golfing post, and there's my mallet. Okay, this is a blow in plane. It's perfectly accurate, hitting the thing in plane. If I hinge my wrist, I'm adding speed. So this is the movement without wrist hinge. This is the movement with wrist hinge. It's very subtle, but it's very important. If I make a movement that is just forearms, I could go out of plane. If the wrists are stiff, the forearms dominate. But if my wrist hinges, it keeps me in plane. Now, think about throwing a dart. You'd struggle to throw a dart well with your wrist in a plaster of Paris cast. There's a little bit of mobility in the wrist hinge. When you're playing snooker or pool, if your wrist was stiff, the cue would climb and fall. It's wrist hinge that keeps the cue level. Even something basic like whisking eggs. If you had a big bowl of eggs and a hand whisk, with no wrist action, you can stir the eggs. The moment you release the wrist hinge, you whisk the eggs. There's more speed with the wrist hinge, but there's also more accuracy. It's a crazy thing. Wrist hinge increases speed, but improves your accuracy. The biggest killer for senior golfers is they lose their wrist hinge. They play without wrist hinge. And then their left arm bends. And then they walk after the shot because the wrists have shut down. The players that swing last, the swings that have longevity, invariably have a good dose of wrist hinge going back and then coming through. So I'm out on the golf course again, and I'm going to hit a low shot for you, just under the canopy down towards the flag. So if I swing back fully, there's 90 degrees of wrist hinge there. If I take the wrist hinge out, I've now got a 2/3 golf swing. So this is a 2/3 golf swing, hitting the ball low. You can see I kept the trajectory down, just catching the edge of the green there. It went 170 yards plus down the hill, but I hit the ball strongly, and because the wrists were passive, it kept the trajectory of the ball much lower. So if you gave me the same shot but said, this time, Luther, go over the trees, I would just go the other way. Using the same club, I'm just going to cock the wrist, very creative, very early in the swing, but my swing plane will remain unchanged. So here's the high shot. Okay, here we go. We're going to hinge early and fully, and we're going to release as quickly and as fully as we can. So off we go. Hinge and hit it high. Again, I have the same swing path, the same plane, but you can see the trajectory, the ball landing softly and stopping. Let's do one more of those for you. When you're hitting the high shot, it's like you're trying to take the ball clean. I'm not using fade spin to do this, I'm purely using wrist cock in the backswing and in the downswing. So I'm going to hinge the wrist early and hit the ball high. Again, going down the hill, got over 170 yards of distance. The plane didn't change. What changed was the activity of the wrists within the plane.